Welcome back to the Craftsman Online podcast. This is a weekly program focused on the relevant topics in Freemasonry and the various aspects of the craft. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints that are shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, appendant, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, Editor-in-Chief of CraftsmanOnline.com, and I'm excited to welcome him back. Brother Angel Millar, welcome back to the pod.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back.
He's here as our brother in Freemasonry, but also as an author, as we're going to be talking about his latest book, The Path of the Warrior Mystic, Being a Man in an Age of Chaos. This is his fifth book as he explores the classic techniques that modern men can embrace through their journey of self-development to become the person that you aspire to be. One of the things that really impressed me was the storytelling that you used to lay out your points and really reinforce the key takeaways from your book. And I'm curious about the legend of the Green Knight. This seems to play a lot through the book. You open up with it in the intro. What appealed to you about the Green Knight, and how did you think that you could use this as like the format or the launching point for your book?
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting legend, and it's a very deceptively simple legend. Very briefly, it begins at the court of King Arthur at Christmas time, when a very large or almost giant green knight enters the hall and challenges the knights to chop off his head, and on the condition that they will allow him to do the same to them next year, which seems a very strange bargain, and the knights aren't very pleased about this. And finally, Sir Gawain steps forward, chops off the head of the Green Knight, who then picks up his head, holds it up, and says, "Find me in the Green Chapel a year from now." And so begins the journey towards the Green Chapel, and towards, as far as Gawain is concerned, towards his own death, since it's very unlikely that he could really survive it. And he finds himself out in the wilds where he has never been before, without a map or even knowing where the Green Chapel is. And I think already there's a lot there. I mean, although it's ostensibly a Christian legend, you can take this back to the wild hunt of paganism, and there's certainly elements of that later on. There's literally hunting over 3 days, but already this idea that you have to be true to your word is a very alien concept today, but it's one that Freemasons should know very well indeed. And if you want to change your life, you have to be true to your word. One of the points about keeping your word is not only to be a man of honor among other men, that also men of honor, but if you want to change your life, you have to know that you are someone who speaks the truth and does what he says.
And this is how the book starts. This is the introduction. It basically paints in your mind that mental picture of like Game of Thrones. I was picturing Dog, the big figure, with a little bit of like 300, where the main character gets pushed out into the wild with a spear and has to go through these rites of passage. And
right, that's exactly right.
It really sets up for the chapters that follow, which kind of build on that, which is, in order to become a man, you kind of have to kill the child within you.
Yeah, and although the references to the Green Knight come and go, if you look at the outline of the book, it kind of loosely follows it. So there is one chapter literally on going out into the unknown. For example, there are other chapters that relate back to it as well.
I want to expand on one of the lines that you had early in the book. I think it's in chapter 1, where you state that a life lived safely will leave us vulnerable.
That's right.
In my phone, I keep a note of just quotes, and that's one that I am going to just always refer back to.
Yeah.
As we begin this path of self-discovery, how do you find risks as like good risk versus bad or unsafe risk?
I think the first thing to do is to ask yourself, if it goes wrong, if it fails badly, are you going to be irreparably damaged? And if the answer is yes, you probably shouldn't take that risk. So you want to take manageable risks. Typically, it's better to build up over a long period, improving incrementally if you have long-term goals. And same with taking risks. Take manageable risks. I've moved countries. So, if you think about that, that's a huge risk. And, and I was lucky because I had a friend here that I could stay with for a few months. But I came here with, $1,000 and ended up living here. And it was very far from uncertain, and it was a big risk. If it had not worked out, I could have gone and lived with my parents in England for a while and tried something else without being homeless or anything like that. So it wasn't a risk that was going to ruin me. And when you think about it, all the things along the way, like going to college, getting a degree in a particular subject, whatever it may be, moving out of my parents' house when I was much younger. All of these things kind of prepared me for moving abroad, even though that was a huge leap. There's a saying that's sometimes said to be a Buddhist saying. It's actually from a movie, The Himalayas, but it's often incorrectly regarded as a Buddhist saying when it's obviously not. When two paths open up before you, take the most difficult path. So I think the real translation or the real lesson would be when you have a choice of paths, take the one that's most challenging. And there's promises to be most rewarding.
As we mentioned, this is Angel's fifth book. Many brothers will know the previous work that he's done that does speak on Freemasonry, the origins of Freemasonry, some of the history, the influences throughout time. You do mention Freemasonry as a fraternity for men. You'll talk about lodges, but this isn't really a Masonic book per se as the previous work. However, the quote that I had shared and others that come through this book, if you are a dedicated Blue Lodge Mason and you've gone through the 3 degrees, you should be able to pick up on some of the points that Brother Millar makes in the larger aspect of them as lessons that come from our ritual. For example, one of the lines that you talked about how man specifically is a divided creature. And you say, quote, a contradiction that is never resolved, only disguised. And it got me thinking to that wonderful part in one of our charges where we're told we can't have two faces, one that's public and one that's private.
But that is the nature of humanity as well. When people look at other people as saintly figures, something is wrong because they are human beings with all kinds of desires and fears and psychological issues as well. And great saints are also great sinners. And we ourselves, on a more mundane level, we go through our day, we may feel optimistic. Later in the day, we might feel pessimistic. But it's difficult to resolve these different aspects. But it should be said that the idea of the path of the warrior mystic is someone who has integrated these two sides. And the warrior is the physical. You can use violence, let's say in self-defense, and the mystic is on the one hand could be very spiritual, or an alternative interpretation would be a creator, a sort of artist. And you do find that warriors at the higher level usually practice the softer arts such as calligraphy, painting, poetry, and so on. But bringing it back to Freemasonry, yes, I mean, also, of course, in the Hieramic legend and the murder of Hiram, he's not murdered by outsiders, but by stonemasons as well. And if you think of that, not as a one person, but let's say as an organism, the way the fraternity is an organism, then there are these sort of internal contradictions as well.
Brother Angel Millar is back on, and we're talking about his new book, which has just been released, The Path of the Warrior Mystic, Being a Man in the Age of Chaos. This is his fifth book, and you can get it on his website, which is angelmillar.com. Again, we're going to get the link of this in the show links for this podcast, but it's angelmillar.com, the website, to order the book. And I want to talk about another point that you had just touched on, because this is a theme throughout the book, which I like the idea that today's man should possess a balance of soft and hard skills. And you give several historical examples of figures that have done this. How does this complete or make a man, a gentleman really, a well-rounded person?
I talk in the book about innovators and very successful and fascinating fascinating individuals of our own time and of the last few decades who had either horrible childhoods or had things go really wrong, which would have been enough to really destroy a lot of people. But they didn't succeed despite those setbacks. They succeeded because of their setbacks, and you find this a lot with especially with innovators, but with very successful people. Often they have terrible lives. When I was writing this book, I sort of reflected on my childhood and earlier years, and I hadn't done for a long time. And when I was 20, I'd been in a very transient and stressful in situation for a couple of years, and it was actually in a sort of very hardcore, let's say, occult group. No sacrifices or anything like that, but it was very sort of mentally high pressure, very mental, and it was a very high pressured environment as well. We were always sort of moving around. I was pretty transient, although I did have an apartment. I was hardly ever there, and it was just a very weird environment. And there were other things going on as well, of course. And my life was very unstable, and I couldn't even imagine making it to the age of 30, actually. And then when I was 20, I had an experience where I felt like I couldn't breathe one night. It was summer, and I woke up and I couldn't get the air through my lungs for a few seconds, and I was kind of slightly I was a little shaken by this, to be quite honest. And then I started breathing okay, and I went back to sleep. And then 2 mornings later, I woke up and I spat into the sink. All this blood came out, and the whole sink was just splashed with blood. And I went to the hospital. Obviously, my lungs were bleeding, which is a very unusual thing for a 20-year-old to experience. But I can tell you, at that moment, I resolved to completely transform my life. And within a year, virtually nothing was the same in my life. So it was a real transformation. I mean, I quit the job I was doing, which was pretty horrendous. When I went to college, I quit the occult organization, of course, straight away. I changed where I was living. I pretty much changed all my friends. I had really long hair. I shaved my head. I was basically a different person within about 12 to 18 months. And had it not have been for that, and had it not have been for all those really difficult years leading up to that, I probably wouldn't have be where I am now. And even when I look back at my childhood, and something I really hadn't thought about, I was always really regarded as the best artist in the school. But I remember at one point I actually had to read in front of the class for a few months because I was regarded as like the worst reader. It's things like that manifest in weird ways. And if you listen to innovators or artists or whatever, often you find that they will say things like, "Oh yeah, I was terrible at school. My teacher would have said I would have been the last one to do what I'm doing, but I'm doing it." And sometimes it's these weird disadvantages or obstacles that push us forward. And one of the problems with modern career guidance, if you listen to such things, is that they will say things like, "Well, just think about what you were good at school," as if that wouldn't have occurred to you anyway. And it's like the reason that person is stuck is because they've only been thinking about what they were good at school. They should be thinking about what they struggled with and thinking about why, because a lot of the time, again, I never thought of myself as very sporty, and a lot of people don't. In reflection, it wasn't I didn't like sports. I didn't like the ego of team sports that I had to encounter. So, which is why I'm okay with martial arts, because you don't get that. So, but you do have to embrace your struggles, and what I found is that people who can't embrace them and use them to propel them to great change, and who instead think of themselves as victims, and when you meet them, they always tell you how tough life is for them. Those people get very angry, very bitter, and stagnate, and they never go anywhere. And I'm old enough that occasionally I speak to people I knew 20, 30 years ago, and some of them had it easy early on, and now they're completely stuck and miserable because they didn't have the challenges that I went through. And and now every little thing is a challenge for them. And you know, if you have a tough life early on, that's great, because that's really going to push you, and that's going to make you.
It's that balance, and on that theme, one of the things that I thought was interesting was a point you make. It's not just what happened in the past and how we could learn from the past to become a better person, but there's also the chaos, the fact of the modern world that we live in. And
yeah, definitely.
One of the observations that you hit on that I was like, oh my gosh, I got to highlight this, is that we live in a victim society. And I really connected with your point that in order to ignite this inner revolution that we need to do to ourselves of self-improvement, is that we have to be able to, as you put it, refine our ability to overcome disadvantages and make them advantages.
Yeah, and it's very tempting to be presenting yourself as a victim, because it makes you feel important, but actually you're disempowering yourself at the same time. And you know, I'll just say that, you know, since we're interested in initiation, if you go back, you know, certainly into pagan times, a big part of the initiation for men was living wild, maybe even literally living out in the wild somewhere, which wasn't like the wilds we have now. You know, you could get lost and die in you know, in parts of Europe. It'd be hard to do that now. Living like an animal, you know, maybe if having to fend for yourself and kill animals with your bare hands, you know, this kind of thing. And that was a part of the initiation, right? You know, and it's a lot of suffering that young men had to go through. But you know, I think in a way that we do need to go through something like that. Or if we're fortunate enough to not go through that, then you know, you kind of have to somehow energize yourself and not see yourself as a victim of every little thing that comes along, you know.
Another theme you touched on, which does relate to Freemasonry almost directly, and maybe this is a cultural society problem as well, is that you mentioned that today we live in a society of non-joiners, people who don't want to be part of something.
Yeah.
This was kind of heightened by the pandemic, where we were encouraged to be individuals and kind of locked in.
Yeah.
How do we turn that around?
Yeah, so I believe that during the 1970s, it was still about 70% of Americans were regular club attendees. And then from 1984 to it might be actually 1985 to 1994, in that decade, there was a 45% drop in club attendance, which is a huge drop. And then, of course, we can think about the decline in church attendance as well. I mean, I'm not sure what it is in America, but in Great Britain, only 5% of the population go to church. And that's a country that has its own official church, it should be mentioned as well. And so we're becoming more and more isolated. And, you know, it's nice that we can all be individuals, but you know, I would think that the last 18 months should also have taught us that if we can be individuals, but then we're very much at risk as well. People survive because they're in some sort of group. And if you're not in some sort of group, then you may be in big trouble down the road. We need, you know, we may need people for material support at some point. But certainly if we don't, then we're very likely to need other people. Well, in fact, we definitely need other people for moral support. We need other people to tell us when we're going wrong, and we need other people to encourage us when we're doing the right thing as well. And, you know, we really need to hopefully at least have several people in our group that we look up to in some area. You know, maybe, you know, thinking of my friends, I'm sure that I'm better than them in some areas, but I'm sure that they're also better than me in some other areas, or more knowledgeable than me in some areas. And, you know, you really need this sort of group. And you know, Freemasonry is a great blessing for several reasons. One, we can meet people of all different opinions, people with different information and ideas. And you know, one of the problems today, of course, is that people are judged especially by their political affiliation, and you know, seen as absolute monsters if they're the wrong one. And we can actually meet people with different affiliations and understand that they're human beings like everybody else. That is a way of us not falling into that trap of hating other people for no good reason or at all. But we certainly need to be in some kind of group, and I think people will discover actually as we move further into the 21st century that groups are going to be essential for survival.
There's so many things in your book, and I don't want to give them all away because I want the reader to discover some of these gems. But one that did really, it connected with me on a personal level when you talked about people who succeed, as we kind of were in that theme. They tend to think of a family member. And being a third generation Mexican American, when I think of what I define success to be and the plan or the goals or the dreams that I have of things that I want to accomplish in my life, I think of my grandfather who didn't have those opportunities but worked hard every day for it. And that's what helps push me forward. And you and I have talked about this on previous podcasts and also personally, that there's a lot of interesting ideas that you suggest of what men can immediately start doing for self-improvement. Some of those would be meditating or praying to either God or the universe. You actually spend a great deal of time talking about that. I wanted to know, how should one simplify life by focusing on what matters to you? That was a point that you make.
Yeah, well, simplifying is probably a lifelong process, especially if someone has different talents as well. And, as somebody who has a background in the art world, but is focused more and more on writing, it's something I've had to do. But really, I think you have to have a vision of who you think you should be and can be, and then work towards that. And I think one of the ways we complicate things is by thinking, well, what can I do to be successful? What can I do to give me some material benefit? And we need that, of course. But when we get all these like fleeting ideas and things we might want to try, but I think to simplify, you have to ask, who am I really? When push comes to shove, who am I? And then if you can figure that out, and you can maybe figure that out by asking, what kind of legacy do I want to leave, or who do I want to help? And for myself, obviously, I want to help men and young men in particular, perhaps. And the kind of legacy I want to leave probably is to, I've help men in the future after I'm dead through my writing, and to get people to think differently and to develop themselves as a whole. And so for me, besides writing, which of course I have to do every day, besides that, then I also need to exemplify it. So I do work out probably at least 6 hours a week, trying at least every other day, practice martial art. And consequently, I would say that art has gone a little bit by the wayside. One that I do some, but it's not the main focus, because it's not really how I see my legacy going, or it's not going to help me leave behind what I want to leave behind. So I think, if you think about who you really are, who you want to help, and what kind of legacy you want to leave behind, then you'll probably figure out who you are, and then you have to focus on that and try to embody it as well, not just make it an intellectual exercise. I would say you want to avoid intellectualism and politics as much as possible, which are just very draining and very manipulative, and always changing and requiring you to change your mind and essentially lie to yourself as opinions are changed, and instead focus on developing yourself as a whole as much as possible. We all have different potentials, but if you can develop your body, your mind, and your spirit in some way, I think that's a good foundation.
I think a lot of men come to Freemasonry because they're seeking the answer to the who am I question, but also they're seeking the answer to the larger question, well, then what does this all mean and how can I be a better person? So again, these aren't things that you're going to answer after reading any book. This is a lifelong process. And to that, I want to touch back on our friend. I was saying it wrong when I was reading the book, but Sir Gawain of the Green Knight tale.
Yeah, Sir Gawain, yeah.
We wonder, like, what happens to this guy? In the beginning, and as you had outlined, he's told, hey, come back here a year from now, and I'm going to chop your head off with an axe. And you touch on that the progression of the story throughout the book, but you get to the eventual point where you say, becoming ourselves requires sacrifice, and that striving to be the person we were destined to be, we find the real meaning in life. And that was another one of those, like, let me get out the highlighter and highlight that, because that was very profound to me. That life really is a learning process.
Yeah, that's right. Well, in regards to sacrifice, this is something that's inevitable. And I mean, it seems to me that people feel that they can get something for nothing these days. At least a lot of people, or that they're entitled to get things for nothing. And certainly, I come from Great Britain, where there's a much bigger welfare state. And, even during COVID, the British people were much more looked after by the British government than the US citizens were, I can tell you. Plus, their 6 weeks vacation a year. But all of that sounds very appealing. And on the one hand, it is very appealing because we all love to be looked after and, know that there's an enormous safety net rather than knowing that we're in a much riskier situation in the US. But the downside of that is it kind of grinds you down in a really weird way that you don't really want to aspire, or that you can't aspire, because it's difficult to, if you're given enough money by the government that you can rent a government subsidized housing and go to the pub a couple of times a week, it becomes very difficult to break out that cycle and think, no, I'm going to improve myself. And which might mean, let's say you launch a business and it makes even less money than that, or let's say you only make slightly more than that, but you're working 80 hours a week. Well, what's the point? And so that situation kind of encourages you to not try. And although, America is a harder place to live in many respects, this idea of freedom is ultimately a good one, that you're only responsible for yourself. But, if you really put a lot of effort into it, you might become something. And it takes a lot of sacrifice, for sure, a lot of sacrifice. And that might mean working really hard or thinking outside of the box. It's probably going to mean losing friends along the way. It's going to mean moving to another city, maybe. But all kinds of sacrifices will have to be made. But the question is, do you want to be you, or do you want to not be you? And do you want to just fit in with people that are maybe less than you could be?
And in the case of Sir Gawain, Sir
yeah.
Gawain, he spent a whole year trying to figure out what his demise was going to be. He was convinced that he was going to get his head lopped off, and instead, it doesn't happen to him. But in that year, you would think he's learned what the meaning of life is, right?
Yeah, well, if you think about your death for a year, you would definitely have a clearer idea of what you should be doing with your life. And, Steve Jobs said famously that he would think about his death every day. And if he wasn't enjoying his life for enough days in a row, then he would change what he was doing. And, this idea of reflecting on death, of course, is very Masonic. It's obviously a big part of Freemasonry, and we do like skulls and crossbones as well. And, but, of course, it's in other traditions as well. And, Christianity, Jesus on the cross, but not only that, with the memento mori, this sort of meditation on how to die well, that was around during the plague. A Catholic nun has recently revived that, before COVID, I should say. And so, yeah, reflecting on death is important. And, again, the Hagakura recommends the samurai reflect on dying in gruesome ways every day. And if you reflect on your death and on your mortality, it will or it should help you to figure out how to spend your life. And I think one of the problems is people live as if they're immortal and they're not going to die. And a lot of people, or some people now, hope that they won't die and are trying to find all kinds of pharmaceutical ways around that. But what kind of person would you be if you could live 300 years? Probably not particularly nice, I would suggest. All things will go wrong. Death is part of our condition, and reflecting on it will help us to know who we are and what we should do with the time we've got.
Speaking of time, I appreciate your time. I know this is a busy time for you. I couldn't imagine investing months, years into writing the book. So whatever vacation plans you have, whatever holiday you have planned has been well earned, my brother, well earned.
Yeah, well, I usually spend vacations writing. So.
And if Masonic education is important to you, we've got a website as well. That's craftsmanonline.com. A reminder that new episodes of the Craftsman Online podcast are available for download every Monday morning. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.